My first exposure to Elliott wave was in 2003 by reference from Richard Russell, who had mentioned some of Bob Proctor's work. I picked it up, and it was the historical context that just captured me. That's what grabbed me, because I suddenly didn't feel so special. The unearthing of socioeconomics for me personally was a pretty bizarre experience, and I'll tell you exactly where I was. I was on a flight from Amsterdam to Boston on my way back from northern Mozambique, where I'd been looking for investment opportunities. My thinking at the time was that China's expansion was going to eventually consume resources around the world, and in large part I thought of East Africa as being a perfect place for them to go. So the year was 2004. I want to say it was in the fall of 2004, and on the plane on the way back I had been carrying around with me these two massive treatises. One was the Wave Principle of Human Social Behavior, and the other was Pioneering Studies in Socioeconomics. And I finally, on this long enough flight, got to a point in Human Social Behavior where the book, I kind of, not to be too dramatic about it, but I essentially closed the book and dropped it on my lap and realized that what I had just read was the lattice work of my life up until that point. The idea of every decision that I had made, everything I'd become convinced of, everything I was afraid of, was retroactively explained inside this book as a function of human social mood. And it was almost as if the scales fell off my eyes, and everything made sense to me, going all the way back to, for example, I'm originally from Zimbabwe. When I left school, I started, my first business was a safari business. I was a professional hunter and safari guide in the very early 1990s. And what I enjoyed was a spectacular success out of nowhere. My business boomed, and I, of course, was convinced that it was because of my own innate magic and special skill sets. What I never really realized is that everybody around me was getting involved in the safari business. I decided to move into the venture capital side and raise money for myself as a startup safari operator, and was very effective at that. I enjoyed tremendous success overnight. I then decided to move to the United States and get involved in the investment business. Of course, this was through the 1990s. Everybody was convinced that the investing business was the way to go. So I moved to the United States. I ended up working on Wall Street as a stockbroker, which you've got to ask yourself, what's a Zimbabwean professional hunter doing working as a stockbroker in New York, et cetera, et cetera. Right up until the NASDAQ bubble, the NASDAQ bust, and it was shortly thereafter, this is now 2004, that I got to see this in, as I say, this kind of retrospect that explained everything to me. But the greatest part about it was that if this book had explained all of my actions up until this point, the book wasn't finished. There were more chapters, exactly. There were physically more chapters for me to read, and what I immediately felt was this perspective that had shifted, and my allowance to go forward and see things in a completely different light. And that changed everything for me. And I talk with my family and friends, I'm the luckiest person they'll ever meet, and that's certainly been the case. For example, I chose to close down my business and leave Zimbabwe in 1998. At the time, Zimbabwe was, why would we talk about Zimbabwe? Because like anything else, its contractions and expansions are driven by social mood. And so if this is applicable to a little boy from the bush in Africa, I should think it's applicable at the sharpest end of the spear, US and Western economics and marketplaces and so forth. But I elected to leave in it was March of 1998. And when I did, Zimbabwe was just booming. And there was a sense of tremendous peace and opulence, prosperity. And I don't claim any clairvoyance at the time, but my departure was met with some pretty scathing comments from friends of mine. They said, "What are you doing?" I had just, for example, completed a very long safari for National Geographic. It was a 3-month source-to-sea trip of the Zambezi River. That was, if you were in the safari industry, that was the deal. If you had made it, if National Geographic had been your crew, you were dialed in. So all of my friends were saying, "What were you thinking? Why are you leaving right now?" And I just felt like it was time to move on, and the pull of the United States and the opportunity to live there was huge, too big for me to pass up. And so I left. Shortly after I left, it imploded. And it imploded so fast and so devastatingly that my family was left behind. I felt like I had walked out of a building that had collapsed the second I left. Inflation went from 11 or 12% to 18,000%. I have friends who suddenly went from having a standing army of workers wanting to work for them to having to pay their employees twice in a day because the inflation was so rampant that what they paid them at lunchtime wouldn't buy them dinner that night. So that all happened as I left. And that all of these things, again, coming back to that insight on that KLM flight, all of this made sense. And its subsequent troubles, the social issues, family and friends being battered and assaulted by crowds and riots and so forth. So the best experience the earliest strong experience or positive experience that I had with the application of socionomics was in 2005. I had, at the time, like anybody else, become convinced that by owning real estate and rental properties, that would be the surest path to my global domination. I had 2 properties, 3 units, and it was in the spring of 2005 that I started considering the implications of a housing bubble and potential bust. But I was already physically and emotionally invested in the non-bust scenario. I needed that to not be true. And so the very first application of socionomics was asking myself why I was so convinced of this, why I was convinced that real estate would continue forever, that I had believed the stories that no one's making any more land and people are moving here because of the lifestyle or whatever it is, all of these stories that we come up with to frame our decision-making process. And so what socionomics allowed me to do was to stop and question what were pneumatic, fundamental, and really poorly grounded beliefs that I had. So by summer of 2005, I had sent an email to an economist that I won't mention, but is someone of tremendous repute, and I still have tremendous respect for him, read his stuff all the time, always get value from it. And I had shared with him in an email the possibility of this housing boom ending in disaster. That started an email conversation that essentially ended with him saying, kind of pat, now young Padawan, just settle yourself down. So by spring of 2006, so I'm a slow learner, it had taken me a year. Spring of 2006, I decided to sell the properties I had. I was going into contract on a condo that I was going to live in a city in the Northeast. I retreated from that, sold my rental properties, and elected to rent. My thinking at the time was that if this glut of housing went the way this boom turned into a glut, that housing, that rental prices on high-end properties would be a dime a dozen. Within the space of 9 months, I was renting a 2,500 square foot home on the ocean with a private beach, spectacular views from every room in the house for less than the property taxes. Less than the property taxes. So being able to hold to that, to have the insight, thanks of course to the work of Elliott, of Bob, of the Socionomic Institute, and being able to apply it to my own life, it's immeasurable benefits. And it went on and on. I did the same thing for years, all through the bust. I lived on a 100-acre ranch with 14 horse stalls and spectacular views of the Rocky Mountains. It's ridiculous.